Hey, now it's the Rob from 106.1 KISS FM here with my 16-bit colleague.
Hey guys, it's Steve, web contributor to 1061evansville.com.
And he's one half of the 16-bit superstars as far as I'm concerned. So, Steve, I think we have a very fun topic to tackle here today.
We do.
The topic today is going to be games that peaked in the 16-bit generation, which, in my estimation, I know you can argue other things, includes Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, for the most part, you know? And there are, I would say that is my favorite time of video games. When I was just, an adolescent and really becoming my own as a video gamer, those games of the 16-bit generation really spoke to me. So there are some games that got better when they went to the 16-bit generation, and then there are some that got worse after the 16-bit generation. We're each going to focus on 5 games that peaked in that early 90s, mid-90s, 16-bit era. You want to get things started, Steve?
Yeah, I can do that. My first topic, or my first item, is Tetris.
Really?
Yeah, I know it came out with the Game Boy, and it was popular there, and as a puzzle game, it just kind of took off to me, and I really remember that being like the game. People are like, do you play this? Do you play this? And it's so addictive. So I definitely had to get that in my top 5.
No, I mean, I can understand that. I would think that Tetris actually had its heyday with the first Game Boy, with the first run Game Boy. It was the Pac-Man game. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it certainly had a life after that for sure. I've got a few games over here I'm going to show. The first one is this one. It says Donkey Kong Country. Donkey Kong, I know, is, I believe, your favorite video game character of all time.
Yes.
And he originated in the arcades, and he had time on Nintendo. And I feel like the best he's ever looked, the best he's ever been, was on Super Nintendo, Donkey Kong Country from 1994, I believe. This game had 3 on the Super Nintendo. And then Donkey Kong Country has kind of continued into the future, like Nintendo 64, and there's a title on the Wii and a title on the Wii U. None of them as good as this little 16-bit cartridge in my hand, Donkey Kong Country. In my opinion, climaxed, finished, peaked on the Super Nintendo. Steve, number 4.
My number 4, I guess I went a little more old school. I was thinking of the first Nintendo Entertainment System.
Okay.
So I want to mention Double Dragon.
You think it peaked in the 16-bit generation?
Yeah, I think right in the middle of the NES and maybe even Super Nintendo. I know they had like maybe 3 games that were really big, and then just not heard from.
Double Dragon, yeah. I mean, it actually kind of fell off, I think, after the 16-bit generation, but okay, I'm with you.
So it definitely hit a high peak and then just kind of, like you said, fell off.
My RPG fans probably recognize Final Fantasy as the leader in role-playing games. I know that I certainly do. It had, well, in the US there was 1 entry on the Nintendo. There were 2 in Japan. And then when Final Fantasy went to the Super Nintendo, this is a PlayStation compilation of it, but the 16-bit versions right here. The Final Fantasy games on Super Nintendo, which include 2 and 3 in the US, which was, let's see, 4 and 6 in Japan, those to me are the best of the Final Fantasy games. Now, Final Fantasy is still very alive and kicking, and did have a life after the Super Nintendo. I would say, probably most people would say Final Fantasy VII is the best. And I think Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation 1 is a great game. But that game peaked, in my opinion, in the 16-bit generation, 2 and 3. Final Fantasy 2 and 3 or 4 and 6 in Japan. My goodness. A-plus games that I've plunked like 50 hours into both of them. So, what about you, Steve? What's your third greatest game that peaked in the 16-bit era?
Actually, if you go into the sports genre, before the name Madden, you'll remember Tecmo. And they did Tecmo Bowl and Tecmo Super Bowl. They did other sports, but the Tecmo Bowl games were their big ones.
Right.
And they never got licensed by the NFL, so their teams are just labeled by their home cities.
Don't they even have like fake character names, or am I thinking of a different game?
I think they do have created character names.
But like you can kind of associate them with their NFL counterpart?
Yes.
Yeah, those are great football games. Yeah, and I have a friend, John, who plays video games all the time. His favorite game of all time is Tecmo Super Bowl.
Okay,
on the NES,
exactly.
so
very good game.
A great reference. Here's my third favorite. Now, this is actually my all-time favorite video game. This is The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past. The number one game of all time. The only thing keeping this out of my number one spot is the fact that this game had a great life after the Super Nintendo. Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Skyward Sword, the list goes on and on. Twilight Princess, all fantastic games. This is a game that showed that the Super Nintendo could do things better than what it was doing on the original Nintendo. This game plays very much like the original Zelda. However, it's bigger, it's better, you can tell a story, you can convey emotion in a different way than you could on the NES. So this to me is a great example of a game that got better, but it slightly got worse in my opinion afterwards, only because those games aren't this. This to me, have you played this game?
I have played that game. I'm not a huge Zelda fan, but I have.
To me, is the pinnacle of gaming right there.
Yeah.
So what about you, Steve? Let's go into the top two.
Again, going kind of old school, and on the same line as Double Dragon, Contra.
Oh, so you think the Contras on Super Nintendo are better than the ones on Nintendo?
I think they kind of
that fourth
made way.
That fourth one is so good.
Yeah.
And they had, do you know they went to the PlayStation with Contra too, but those were just not.
I've never played it on that system.
Not good. I don't recommend those.
And I also give Contra the label. It was the first game I did.
The code?
Yeah, the code.
That's awesome, the Konami code. All right, my second example of games that peaked on the Super Nintendo, I kind of give the same description for this as I do for the Zelda games. Had a very strong life after the Super Nintendo, but in my opinion, this game, Super Mario World, is Super Mario's high point. I'm going to say it again. No Mario game, correct me if I'm wrong, is better than this one on the Super Nintendo. And Mario had he's the biggest name in gaming. Is making games, more than once per year. But in my opinion, this showed, again, what the Super Nintendo and the 16-bit generation, it was the games that were great on the Nintendo got even better on the Super Nintendo. As far as platforming goes, he has some great adventure sense, but this one, the debut of Yoshi, the cape, the feather, turning inside the fences and the Koopa Troopas and Star Road, number one Mario game I'm holding in my hand right now.
Agreed.
All right, Steve, what, in your opinion, is the all-time greatest game franchise that peaked on the 16-bit generation?
Okay, well, again, I kind of went outside of the topic. And he peaked early, but he's still a strong character, and he's one of the most important characters in gaming. It's Pac-Man.
Really?
He actually peaked in a 10-bit era.
Okay, I'm all ears.
But they kind of continued with him. As far as new material, he hasn't done a lot since then.
Pac-Man has been mishandled in the past few decades.
Yes, he has. But he's almost like... He's Bruce Lee, where he came in, made an impact, and then kind of got out. And, he's still... When you think Pac-Man, you think maze. You know what Pac-Man is.
Listen, if you're going to make a Mount Rushmore of video games, one of those names and faces has to be Pac-Man.
Yes.
Pac-Man fever kicked off the video game craze in the U.S., and we have him to thank for this blog that we're doing right here.
Yes.
I feel like I have the right answer as to what the number one game that peaked in the Super Nintendo 16-bit generation is. This is a very great example of a game that was very good on NES, got much better on the Super Nintendo, and then fell apart thereafter. I don't know how much experience you have with this game, Steve, but this is Super Metroid. Have you ever played it?
I have played it.
What are your thoughts?
I honestly don't have a lot of thoughts. It kind of got masked over by some of the games I normally do play, but I'm peaked to hear what you think about it.
Every video game fan, or at least every Metroid fan, has been clamoring for a 16-bit Metroid game again, because this was where the game peaked. It looked better, but played similarly to its older brother on the Nintendo. But then when it did not have an iteration on the Nintendo 64, but GameCube had two Metroid games. They're very different. They were 3D. They looked good. The first one was okay. Then the Wii had a few of them. The Wii had Other M, which people hated. I didn't hate, but people did. And it also had Corruption, Metroid Prime 3. Those games while they may be Metroid in name, may have Samus in the games, are so different than the Metroid games that people who grew up playing them love.
Yep.
And this, to me, is the all-time example of games that peaked, that were just built for the 16-bit engine, Steve.
Well, I'm definitely going to have to give that another try.
Yeah, Super Metroid, I mean, you can get on the Virtual Console, whatever you play on, you can find Super Metroid anywhere. I highly recommend it. And it's one of my top 5 favorite games of all time.
All right.
So you can check it out. Steve, as always, it's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
We'll join you next week. We'll have a different topic for you. One time we should maybe even build our own Mount Rushmore of video game characters. Maybe that will be next week's topic.
Challenge accepted.
All right, then. Until next week, thank you for watching the 16-Bit Superstars. We will see you later.
Thanks, guys.